Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Alexander Fleming, the accidental pioneer of antibiotics. Chapter 1, Roots in the Scottish Highlands. Born on August 6, 1881, in the serene landscapes of Lochfield near Darvel, Ayrshire, Scotland, Alexander Fleming was the third of 4 children to Hugh Fleming and Grace Sterling Morton. His father, a farmer, had 4 children from a previous marriage, making Alexander part of a large, blended family. The Flemings lived on an 800-acre farm, surrounded by rolling hills and moorlands, where young Alexander, affectionately known as Alec, developed a deep appreciation for nature. The untimely death of his father, when Alexander was just 7 years old, brought significant changes to the family dynamics. Despite the hardships, his mother ensured that education remained a priority. Alexander began his schooling at Loudon Moor School, a modest institution with a handful of students of varying ages. He later attended Darvel School, requiring him to walk several miles daily, often braving harsh weather conditions. To keep warm, he would carry hot potatoes in his pockets, which doubled as his lunch. Recognizing his academic potential, Alexander earned a scholarship to Kilmarnock Academy at the age of 11. The academy, known for its rigorous curriculum, offered courses in chemistry, geography, physics, and physiology. Alexander excelled in his studies, consistently achieving top grades. His time at Kilmarnock not only honed his intellectual abilities, but also instilled in him a lifelong respect for learning. At 13, an opportunity arose for Alexander to continue his education in London, where his older brother Tom was studying medicine. Joining Tom, Alexander enrolled at the Royal Polytechnic Institution. His academic prowess led to accelerated progress, and he completed his studies by the age of 16. Subsequently, he worked at a shipping office for 4 years, a period he later described as unfulfilling. An inheritance from his uncle provided the means for Alexander to pursue a career in medicine, setting the stage for his future contributions to science. Chapter 2, From Farm Fields to City Streets. The cold morning air of London was a far cry from the windswept hills of Lochfield. At the age of 16, Alexander Fleming had left behind the green fields and open skies of rural Scotland for the crowded streets and smoky skyline of the British capital. He worked quietly and dutifully at a shipping office for 4 years. Though his work involved numbers, names, and schedules, there was something missing. Every day felt the same, and each evening he returned home with a lingering sense that his talents were being wasted. He did not complain, but those around him noticed his quiet restlessness. It was his older brother, Tom, who finally spoke up. Tom Fleming had become a respected physician, and he recognized in his younger brother a mind that craved more than routine. "Why not study medicine?" he asked one evening as they sat over tea. "You're bright, Alec. You always have been." Alexander had considered the idea before, but now, with his brother's encouragement and a small inheritance from a recently deceased uncle, the path became possible. In 1901, at the age of 20, he enrolled at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington, London. The school was known for its strong reputation in medical training. For Fleming, the classrooms, laboratories, and endless shelves of medical books were like a new world opening. He didn't just study, he absorbed knowledge: anatomy, pathology, bacteriology. Subjects that challenged many students seemed to come naturally to him. Professors soon recognized him not only as hard-working, but as someone who noticed details others missed. It was during this time that Fleming encountered Sir Almroth Wright, a pioneer in immunology and an advocate for using vaccines to fight disease. Wright was an intense, passionate man with sharp eyes and a quick temper. Many students found him intimidating. Fleming, however, admired his courage to challenge traditional ideas and speak up for new scientific methods. Wright, in turn, saw great promise in the quiet Scottish student. He offered Fleming a position in his research team after graduation, allowing him to stay on at St. Mary's as a bacteriologist. This opportunity would shape the rest of Fleming's career. But Fleming was not only skilled in medicine, he was also a skilled marksman. In fact, he had joined the rifle club at St. Mary's and quickly became one of its best shooters. His talent with firearms almost led him in another direction entirely. There was a moment when he considered joining the military, tempted by the idea of adventure and honor. But in the end, science called louder. During his early years in research, Fleming worked tirelessly. He studied the ways in which bacteria cause disease and how the body's immune system responded. He focused on antiseptics, the chemicals used to clean wounds. At the time, doctors believed that strong antiseptics killed bacteria and helped healing. But what Fleming saw under the microscope told a different story. He began to notice that antiseptics often killed not only harmful bacteria, but also the body's own white blood cells, the cells responsible for fighting infection. This meant that while antiseptics cleaned wounds, they sometimes slowed the healing process. These observations made Fleming question the accepted medical practices of the time, even though he was still a young researcher. He wrote his findings in several papers, but many doctors ignored them. His ideas seemed too unusual, too new. Fleming, however, remained calm. He was not interested in fame. He simply wanted to understand the truth. His colleagues respected his humility and precision. He worked with quiet focus, rarely boasting of his achievements. Yet those who paid attention saw something rare, a mind both curious and courageous, willing to follow facts even when they led away from popular beliefs. Outside the lab, Fleming was known for his dry sense of humor and love of art. He painted in watercolors and often joked with his colleagues, balancing the intensity of scientific work with small moments of joy. He was also known for being kind to patients. He believed that science should serve people, not just progress. In 1914, as the shadow of war stretched across Europe, Fleming's peaceful life in the lab was about to change. Britain entered World War I, and like many young doctors and scientists, he was called to serve. His experiences in the battlefield hospitals of France would deeply shape his understanding of infection, wounds, and the limits of existing medical knowledge. But before the war would test his knowledge in the harshest of ways. Alexander Fleming had already begun laying the foundation for his greatest discovery. He had chosen medicine over routine, observation over assumption, and truth over tradition. He had moved from the quiet hills of Scotland to the noisy heart of London and found a place where his mind could grow. What he did not yet know was that in the years to come, a simple accident would lead him to change the world. Chapter 3. The Making of a Medical Mind. The year was 1914. Europe stood on the edge of a war that would soon engulf the world. As nations called their young men to arms, Alexander Fleming, now a trained physician and bacteriologist, answered the call in his own way. He joined the Royal Army Medical Corps and was sent to field hospitals in France, where he would face wounds not just of the body, but of the soul. The front lines were no place for the weak-hearted. The trenches were muddy, narrow, and constantly under fire. But it wasn't the bullets that haunted Fleming, it was the infections. Soldiers would survive terrible wounds only to die slowly from sepsis or gangrene. In the absence of effective antibiotics, the fight against infection felt like a losing battle. Fleming's job was to study the nature of these infections and try to find ways to reduce their deadly impact. What he saw disturbed him. Many surgeons still believed in using strong antiseptics to cleanse wounds. They poured chemicals like carbolic acid or iodine directly into deep wounds, thinking it would kill bacteria and save lives. But Fleming, with his keen eye and quiet skepticism, noticed something different. Under the microscope, he saw that while these chemicals killed bacteria, they also destroyed the body's natural defenses, especially the white blood cells. These cells were the body's natural soldiers, fighting off invading microbes. Killing them weakened the body's chances of healing. One day, in a crowded tent hospital, Fleming watched a young soldier die from an infected leg wound. He had survived the shrapnel, the surgery, and even the journey from the battlefield. But the infection spread faster than the body could resist, even with all the antiseptic treatment. Fleming couldn't shake the image from his mind. The boy had been no older than 20. From that moment on, Fleming began recording everything: how wounds were treated, how patients responded, and what types of bacteria were involved. He collected samples from pus and tissue, studying them when he returned to St. Mary's during short breaks from the front. The war, terrible as it was, became a turning point in his thinking. It pushed him to question more boldly, to doubt more deeply, and to search more thoroughly. He became convinced that the future of infection treatment would not lie in stronger chemicals, but in substances that could kill bacteria without harming the patient's body. After the war ended in 1918, Fleming returned to St. Mary's with renewed purpose. He was now a seasoned doctor, not just in the technical sense, but in the emotional sense as well. He had seen too much loss, too many helpless cases. He knew the world needed better tools. It was during these post-war years that Fleming returned full-time to research. His lab was small and somewhat chaotic, filled with glass jars, slides, petri dishes, and a clutter of notes. But for Fleming, it was a place of quiet exploration. His methods were not always conventional. He often allowed experiments to continue for long periods, observing how bacteria behaved over time. He believed in letting nature reveal her patterns rather than trying to force fast conclusions. One of his focuses during this time was lysozyme, a natural enzyme found in bodily fluids like tears, saliva, and mucus. In 1921, while working with nasal mucus, Fleming accidentally discovered that this enzyme could kill certain types of bacteria. It was not the ultimate answer to infection, but it proved something important. The body produced its own antibacterial substances. This discovery gave him hope. If the body had natural defenses, maybe there were other substances out there, perhaps even hidden in plain sight, that could help fight infections more effectively. By this point, Fleming's reputation among scientists was growing. He was respected for his integrity, careful observation, and quiet brilliance. He was not a showman, nor did he chase after fame. His papers were written in simple, clear language, often underlining just the facts. He let the science speak for it. Yet Fleming remained frustrated. Though lysozyme was a promising lead, it worked only on a limited range of bacteria. The bacteria that caused the most deadly infections were unaffected. Still, he pressed on. He continued to collect samples, test natural compounds, and let experiments run for days, sometimes weeks. Many of his colleagues saw his persistence as admirable, though a few thought he was wasting his time. But Fleming had learned from war that sometimes survival came not from following orders, but from asking questions no one else dared to ask. He had seen too many lives lost to infection. He would not stop until he found something better. In 1927, 10 years after the end of the war, Fleming was still working in the same small lab at St. Mary's. The world around him was changing. New technologies, new ideas, new discoveries. But inside the lab, he remained committed to one goal: finding a substance that could kill harmful bacteria without harming the patient. And then, one quiet September morning, a strange thing happened. A chance event that looked like nothing at first. A mistake, even. But Fleming's mind, sharpened by years of patient observation and wartime urgency, saw something in that moment that others might have missed. He didn't know it yet, but history was about to change. Chapter 4: Battlegrounds and Breakthroughs. It began, like many discoveries, not with a loud noise or grand experiment, but with a forgotten petri dish. It was September 1928. The summer had been unusually warm in London, and Alexander Fleming had just returned from a short holiday. His small lab at St. Mary's Hospital was just as he had left it, cluttered with flasks, petri dishes, glass slides, and scattered notes. Among the many culture plates growing colonies of bacteria, one had been left out on the bench, unintentionally, some might say carelessly. But Fleming never saw accidents the same way others did. As he looked through the stack of dishes, one caught his eye. On the dish, he had been growing a common type of bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus. But something was different. On this particular plate, a blue-green mold had begun to grow. Around the mold, the bacteria had disappeared. It was as if the mold had created a clear circle of protection, a bacteria-free zone. Fleming bent over the dish, fascinated. Many other scientists might have thrown the contaminated plate away without a second thought. But not Fleming. Years of observing and questioning had taught him that nature often whispered its secrets, and it was the patient observer who heard them. He carefully isolated the mold and began testing its effects. Over the next days and weeks, he found that the mold, later identified as penicillium notatum, produced a substance that killed a wide variety of harmful bacteria. More importantly, this substance seemed harmless to human cells. He named the substance penicillin. Fleming's mind immediately went back to the battlefield hospitals, the dying soldiers, and the frustration he had felt when no treatment worked. Could this mold be the answer he had long searched for? Could it be the breakthrough the medical world desperately needed? He tested penicillin on different types of bacteria. The results were astonishing. Penicillin was especially effective against gram-positive bacteria, those responsible for diseases like pneumonia, scarlet fever, meningitis, and syphilis. Even a small amount seemed to stop bacterial growth. But Fleming was cautious. He knew that excitement alone couldn't carry the discovery forward. It would require evidence, patience, and persistence. In 1929, he published a paper in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. The article was titled On the Antibacterial Action of Cultures of a Penicillium, with special reference to their use in the isolation of bee influenzae. Yet, surprisingly, the scientific community didn't react with enthusiasm. Many doctors and researchers saw penicillin as interesting, but not practical. Fleming himself had struggled to purify the substance in large quantities. It was unstable, broke down quickly, and could not yet be manufactured at scale. The full medical potential of penicillin remained just out of reach. Still, Fleming continued his work, even though it often felt lonely. He was not a chemist, and he lacked the tools and support to develop penicillin into a usable drug. But he believed in it. He preserved mold samples, wrote detailed notes, and spoke about his findings at conferences, even if the rooms were half empty and the applause half-hearted. In the meantime, others began to take notice. Slowly, at the University of Oxford, two scientists, Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, would later pick up where Fleming left off. But that part of the story had not yet begun. For now, Fleming's lab remained quiet. He had discovered something remarkable, something that had the power to change medicine forever. But the world, busy with its own concerns, was not yet ready to listen. Outside the lab, London moved forward. Cars rushed down rain-slick streets, children played in smoky courtyards, and newspapers reported on politics, sports, and rising tensions across Europe. Few could have imagined that a mold growing in a petri dish might one day save millions of lives. Inside the lab, Fleming watched penicillin grow. In a small glass dish, in the corner of a modest room, something invisible to the eye but powerful beyond measure was taking shape. A breakthrough had happened, but the battle to bring it to the world was only beginning. Fleming, with his calm demeanor and quiet certainty, was ready. He had seen what nature could do when carefully observed. He had followed his curiosity from a Scottish farm to the heart of one of the greatest medical discoveries in history. Now, all he needed was time and the right allies. Chapter 5. A Drop of Discovery. For many scientists, discovery is the end of a journey. For Alexander Fleming, it was just the beginning. In the months following the accidental discovery of penicillin, his tiny lab at St. Mary's buzzed with cautious excitement. But turning that moment of curiosity into something the medical world could actually use proved far more difficult than he imagined. Penicillin, as a substance, was fragile. It broke down quickly and was hard to isolate. Fleming, with his skill in bacteriology, but limited training in chemistry, struggled to extract pure samples. Each time he tried to grow the mold in larger quantities, he ran into a wall. Temperature, moisture, nutrients, each factor seemed to affect the yield. He joked with colleagues that the mold had a mind of its own, but deep down, he was frustrated. Still, every morning he returned to his lab. He studied the behavior of Penicillium notatum with quiet determination. He tried different growth mediums, bread, broth, even milk. He observed how it interacted with various bacteria and recorded its limits. He tested its effects on lab animals, and he noticed something remarkable. Penicillin wasn't just effective, it was gentle. Unlike antiseptics, it didn't damage healthy cells. It worked silently, letting the body heal itself. This, to Fleming, was the most beautiful part. Yet, despite his belief in penicillin's potential, few others shared his vision. Medical journals gave his 1929 paper little attention. A few scientists wrote back with polite interest, but no one offered funding or laboratory support. Most dismissed the mold as a curiosity, nothing more. The problem wasn't that people doubted Fleming's observations, they doubted penicillin's usefulness. It wasn't stable, it couldn't be produced in large amounts, and at the time, the medical world was still focused on vaccines, antiseptics, and theories from the past. Fleming, however, did not give up. Over the next several years, he continued his quiet experiments. He kept samples of the original mold in cold storage. He shared them with any scientists who asked. When medical students passed through his lab, he told them the story of the Petri dish, the mold, and the strange clear ring. Most nodded, smiled, and moved on. But Fleming didn't mind. He believed in the long view. He had no ambitions of fame or wealth. He wasn't seeking headlines or honors. He wanted to understand nature's secrets and help people heal. To him, that was enough. Outside the lab, the world was changing once again. The 1930s brought economic hardship, political unrest, and the rise of dangerous ideologies across Europe. Another war was brewing, and medicine still lacked tools to fight the infections that followed every bullet and bomb. In 1935, Fleming tried once more to purify penicillin. He collaborated with a chemist at St. Mary's, Stuart Craddock, and a biologist named Frederick Ridley. They made small progress, but were still unable to stabilize the substance. At one point, they managed to extract enough pure penicillin to treat eye infections in rabbits. The results were promising, but the supply was far too small for wider tests. Eventually, both Craddock and Ridley left the project. Fleming, too, grew discouraged. He never abandoned penicillin entirely, but it slipped from the center of his attention. He moved on to other research, still curious, still working but always with one eye on the shelf where the mold samples quietly waited. Then, just as quietly as it had arrived, penicillin began to attract new attention. In 1939, a team of scientists at the University of Oxford, led by Howard Florey, a brilliant pathologist, and Ernst Boris Chain, a passionate biochemist, picked up a copy of Fleming's old paper. They were looking for natural antibacterial agents and saw something in those dusty words that others had missed. Unlike Fleming, they had the chemical expertise and resources to go further. They began to study the mold in detail. By 1940, they had successfully extracted and purified penicillin in enough quantity to test on animals. The results were stunning. Infected mice that would have died survived. The team quickly realized what they had: a powerful, life-saving drug. Back at St. Mary's, Fleming received a letter from the Oxford team. They told him of their success and thanked him for his early work. Fleming was delighted. After more than a decade of quiet persistence, his belief in penicillin was finally being confirmed. He traveled to Oxford to visit Florey and Chain. The visit was warm, respectful, and full of shared excitement. Fleming had discovered the substance. Florey and Chain had unlocked its potential. Together, they were about to change the future of medicine. As the Second World War erupted, the demand for penicillin became urgent. Soldiers, civilians, and entire nations would soon depend on a drop of discovery born from a forgotten dish and a careful mind. Fleming, always modest, did not boast. When asked how he made his discovery, he famously replied, "I didn't. Nature did that. I just noticed it." Chapter 6: War, Wounds, and the Wonder Drug. The world was at war once again. By 1940, Europe had descended into chaos. Nazi Germany marched across borders. cities were bombed into rubble, and battlefields stretched across continents. Soldiers fought in trenches, deserts, and mountains, often far from hospitals and clean conditions. The deadliest enemy wasn't always a bullet or bomb. It was infection. This time, however, medicine had something new to offer. In the Oxford laboratories, Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, working with a team of chemists and biologists, had done what few thought possible. They had taken Alexander Fleming's fragile mold and turned it into something usable, a purified, concentrated form of penicillin. Their early animal tests had been successful, but now they needed to test the drug on humans. The first real trial came in 1941. A man named Albert Alexander, a police officer, had been scratched by a rose thorn while gardening. The small cut had become badly infected. His face swelled, his eyes closed, and he developed a high fever. Doctors tried everything, but nothing worked. As a last hope, they gave him penicillin. Within 24 hours, Alexander's condition improved dramatically. The swelling reduced, his fever dropped. He could speak again. But there was one problem. They didn't have enough penicillin. The scientists had only been able to grow a small supply, and they soon ran out. Despite their best efforts, even extracting penicillin from Alexander's urine and reusing it, he died a few days later. The loss was painful, but the results were clear. Penicillin worked. They just needed more of it. This challenge became urgent as the war deepened. Soldiers wounded on the battlefield often died not from their injuries, but from the infections that followed. If penicillin could be produced in large enough quantities, it could save thousands, maybe millions of lives. Florey and Chain reached out to the US government in 1941. They traveled to the United States, carrying samples of the mold in glass bottles hidden inside their suitcases and coats. American scientists, recognizing the importance of the drug, joined the effort. Soon, a secret but massive collaboration between British and American labs began. The race was on not to build a bomb, but to grow a mold. Scientists tried every method imaginable to increase production. They experimented with different cultures and fermentation methods. One scientist even found a more productive strain of penicillium on a moldy cantaloupe bought at a Peoria, Illinois fruit market. It became a running joke that the wonder drug came from a piece of spoiled fruit. With government support and wartime urgency, pharmaceutical companies joined in. Factories were converted into penicillin production plants. Deep tank fermentation methods were developed, allowing the mold to grow in huge vats instead of shallow trays. By 1943, penicillin was ready for use on the battlefield. In North Africa, wounded soldiers were treated with the new drug. The results were miraculous. Infections that once meant amputation or death were now stopped. Wounds healed faster. Soldiers returned to duty. Doctors, who had once watched helplessly, now carried a powerful tool in their kits. The news spread. By 1944, just before D-Day, enough penicillin had been produced to treat all Allied soldiers wounded during the invasion of Normandy. It became known as the wonder drug and was celebrated as one of the greatest medical breakthroughs of the century. Fleming, now in his early 60s, watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. Though he had not been directly involved in the mass production, his discovery had started it all. He never claimed full credit. He often said, "I didn't invent penicillin. Nature did that. I just found it." Yet, without his careful eyes, his patience with mold, and his belief in nature's wisdom, penicillin might have remained just another forgotten experiment. In 1945, Fleming shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine with Florey and Chain. In his acceptance speech, he offered a warning along with gratitude. "The time may come," he said, "when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant." It was a sobering message. Even as the world celebrated penicillin's triumph, Fleming understood the risks of misuse. He had seen too many infections grow stronger when not properly treated. Still, in that moment, the world had reason to hope. Penicillin had turned the tide of war in hospitals and saved more lives than any single weapon. It had opened the door to a new era of antibiotics, changing the way medicine viewed bacteria and infection. And it all began with a forgotten dish, a speck of mold, and a scientist who paused long enough to wonder what it meant. Chapter 7. Ripples of Change. In the months and years following the end of the Second World War, penicillin became more than a medical tool. It became a symbol of hope, of science, and of what could happen when curiosity met perseverance. Hospitals, once places of helplessness in the face of infection, were transformed. Before penicillin, diseases like pneumonia, scarlet fever, syphilis, and meningitis could be death sentences. After penicillin, they became treatable. Entire hospital wings, once filled with patients waiting to die, now emptied as people walked out healed. Doctors spoke of miracle recoveries, of children who stopped coughing overnight, of soldiers whose wounds closed clean instead of festering. One physician described it as watching death in reverse. The drug's success triggered a revolution. Pharmaceutical companies, energized by wartime production, now turned their attention to antibiotics. Laboratories across the world began a new search. If penicillin could be found in mold, what other secrets might nature hold? Soon, new antibiotics followed: streptomycin, chloramphenicol, tetracycline. Medicine had entered what many called the golden age of antibiotics. But in the heart of London, at St. Mary's Hospital, Alexander Fleming remained largely unchanged. He still wore his white coat with the ink stains. He still walked the hospital halls with quiet steps. And though the world now recognized him as a hero, Fleming himself never seemed entirely comfortable with the fame. He gave lectures around the world, traveling to Europe, America, and Asia. Wherever he went, crowds gathered to see the man who had helped defeat infection. Newspapers wrote headlines like, "The man who changed the world and a scientist with a humble heart." Universities gave him honorary degrees. Children sent him letters. The king knighted him in 1944. Yet, when asked what had driven him, his answer was always simple: observation, luck, and not ignoring the obvious. He had not searched for penicillin. He had simply not looked away when he saw something unusual. That, to Fleming, was the difference between missing a miracle and discovering one. Despite the admiration, Fleming also carried worries. He noticed how quickly penicillin was becoming overused. Some doctors prescribed it even when it wasn't needed. Patients, unaware of the science behind the drug, didn't always finish their full treatment. Fleming feared what might come next. At conferences, he warned against resistance. He explained how bacteria, when exposed to low doses of antibiotics, could adapt. "It is not difficult," he said, "to make microbes resistant to penicillin, and the more we use it improperly, the faster it will happen." Most people nodded. Few listened closely. Meanwhile, penicillin continued to spread across the globe. In developing countries, it arrived in small vials and dusty boxes, saving lives where there had once been no hope. In war zones and refugee camps, it was injected by candlelight. In crowded city hospitals, it became part of the routine. The cost dropped, the availability increased, and in time, penicillin became as common as aspirin. But not all ripples were positive. With antibiotics now at the center of medicine, old practices were forgotten. Doctors focused less on hygiene and prevention. Patients began to expect quick cures, not slow healing. And as Fleming predicted, bacteria slowly began to change. By the late 1950s, the first penicillin-resistant strains appeared. Some scientists dismissed them as rare. Others, remembering Fleming's warnings, sounded the alarm. A quiet war had begun, not between nations, but between medicine and mutation. Fleming, now in his 70s, continued to work at St. Mary's. He still kept a small lab and still enjoyed showing young students the mold that had changed everything. Often, he would smile and say, "This is the very dish, the one I forgot to clean." And always, behind the smile, was a sense of wonder. He had grown up milking cows on a quiet Scottish farm. He had walked the halls of a city hospital, observing the unseen. He had seen war and loss, but also healing and discovery. And now, in his later years, He watched a world forever changed because he had paused, looked closer, and asked a simple question: why? Fleming never chased greatness. He had simply stayed curious, and in doing so, he had reminded the world that sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with an ordinary mistake. Chapter 8: The Quiet Legacy. After the noise of wars fades and headlines grow quiet, some figures remain, not because they ask to be remembered, but because what they did cannot be forgotten. For Alexander Fleming, fame came like a wave, sudden, overwhelming, and sometimes uncomfortable. Yet, he never let it carry him away from what mattered most: science, honesty, and teaching. In the years following his Nobel Prize and international recognition, Fleming became a living legend. His name was spoken in medical schools across continents. His discovery had saved millions, and by the late 1940s he could have retired in glory. But retirement was not in his nature. He continued to work at St. Mary's Hospital in London, walking the same corridors where he had once discovered the mold that changed the world. His office was modest. His desk cluttered with journals, microscope slides, and the occasional teacup forgotten among petri dishes. Visitors were often surprised by how ordinary it all seemed. Fleming had always been more interested in the unknown than in celebration. When reporters came asking for quotes, he gave brief answers. When young scientists asked for advice, he gave his time. He often told students, "Watch what happens. Don't dismiss mistakes too quickly." Some of the best discoveries begin with something going wrong. To him, a good scientist was not someone with the best tools or the biggest lab. A good scientist was curious, patient, observant. One of his favorite stories to share was not about penicillin, but about how many people had seen the same mold and thrown it away. They wiped the dish, he said, and never thought twice. That, to Fleming, was the lesson. Discovery isn't just seeing, it's choosing not to look away. In those years, Fleming also worked on other medical problems. He studied how bacteria developed resistance. He wrote about the importance of proper antibiotic use. He explored new strains of penicillin and helped train doctors in its application. But more than anything, he became a teacher, not only in classrooms, but in life. Young researchers came to St. Mary's from across the world: India, France, Brazil, Egypt, Canada. His lab became a place where ideas crossed borders. He greeted each student with kindness, encouraged their questions, and insisted they challenge ideas, even his own. He didn't want followers, he wanted thinkers. He wasn't afraid to admit when he didn't know something. In fact, he welcomed it. "If I knew everything," he once said with a smile, "I wouldn't need to do science." Even though he was soft-spoken, people listened when he talked, not because he demanded attention, but because he had earned respect. Despite his global recognition, Fleming never grew proud or distant. When strangers stopped him on the street, he answered politely. When children wrote letters asking what it felt like to be famous, he often replied with handwritten notes, telling them to stay curious, keep reading, and never stop asking questions. He also remained close to his family. After the death of his first wife, Sarah Marian, he remarried in 1953 to Amalia Kautzer-Vuderekas, a Greek doctor he had met through mutual colleagues. She was intelligent, warm, and deeply respected him, not as a Nobel laureate, but as a man who still kept his microscope lens clean by hand. They spent quiet evenings at home, often talking about science, philosophy, and the future of medicine. To outsiders, he was a public figure. To those closest to him, he was simply Alex, a man who believed that knowledge belonged to everyone. As the 1950s went on, penicillin became the foundation of modern medicine. Yet Fleming often reminded people that it was only the beginning. "There will be more," he said, "but only if we keep asking why." In 1955, just 2 years after marrying Amalia, Fleming fell seriously ill. He had suffered a heart attack. Though doctors did everything they could, the man who had once given the world its most powerful healing tool could not be saved by it. On March 11, 1955, Alexander Fleming passed away in his home in London. The world mourned not just a scientist, but a symbol of humility, persistence, and grace. He was buried at St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the highest honors Britain could offer, a resting place for heroes. Yet those who had known him best believed he would have preferred a quiet bench in the hospital garden, where mold still grew and students still wondered. Even in death, his legacy lived on, not just in antibiotics, but in the way people approached science. He had taught the world that breakthroughs don't always come with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive on a forgotten dish, in a quiet room, under the watchful eye of someone who never stopped paying attention. Chapter 9. The Lasting Impact. When the news of Alexander Fleming's death reached the world, it was met with a quiet pause, a moment of reflection that extended far beyond scientific circles. In laboratories, hospitals, and universities across the globe, people stopped and remembered not just the man who discovered penicillin, but the man who had never sought attention for it. Flags were lowered. Tributes were published in multiple languages. Even world leaders, many of whom had been saved by antibiotics during the war, sent messages of condolence and respect. But Fleming's greatest monument was not carved in stone. It was living, growing in every hospital ward where antibiotics were saving lives. His legacy pulsed through the veins of patients who might never learn his name, yet owed their recovery to what he had uncovered. Just a few decades before, a child with strep throat could have died from a simple fever. A soldier's leg wound could turn into a fatal infection. A mother in labor faced the terrifying risk of sepsis. Now, these dangers were manageable. In cities and villages alike, penicillin became a common tool. Its cost fell. Its reach extended into even the most remote regions. Public health campaigns began introducing it as a basic part of medical care. Clinics across Africa, Asia, and South America were equipped with supplies. Doctors were trained to identify infections and administer proper doses. Lives were being saved not by magic, but by mold. Fleming had changed the map of medicine. But, as with all revolutions, new challenges followed. Not long after his death, concerns he had voiced earlier became real. Reports of antibiotic resistance began appearing in medical journals. In some hospitals, doctors noticed that certain bacterial strains no longer responded to penicillin. The miracle drug, while still powerful, was no longer invincible. Researchers dug deeper. They discovered that overuse and misuse, often in places where antibiotics were handed out without proper instruction, were giving bacteria a chance to adapt. The very tools designed to stop them had become their teachers. In some ways, this confirmed Fleming's fears. He had once said, the greatest misuse of penicillin would be to underdose it, giving bacteria a chance to learn. In classrooms and medical conferences, his words were now quoted as warnings. Governments and health organizations began building regulations. New antibiotics were developed to fight resistant bacteria, but the race was growing harder. The world now understood science could not afford to sleep. And yet, even as problems grew, Fleming's work continued to shine as a symbol of what was possible. In museums, visitors could see his microscope, his laboratory desk, and the famous Petri dish, still showing that clear, bacteria-free circle where the mold had worked its quiet magic. More than relics, they were reminders of something larger, that science often begins in silence, that discoveries come not only from intelligence, but from humility. Universities began adding Fleming's story to their medical ethics courses. He became a case study, not only for the scientific method, but for how to carry fame, responsibility, and truth. Young researchers were taught to question boldly, but observe gently. They were told that sometimes the most important thing in a lab was not the newest machine, but the willingness to notice what others ignore. Fleming had left more than penicillin behind. He left a mindset. In the 1960s, the World Health Organization launched large-scale vaccination and antibiotic distribution programs. Many of these efforts were guided by Fleming's principles: simple solutions, shared knowledge, and respect for natural processes. In developing countries, medical students studied his story as a source of hope that greatness could come from quiet places. In Western institutions, his name was carved into lecture halls and hospital wings. Children wrote reports about him. Streets and schools were named after him. A crater on the moon even bears his name, a tribute from a new generation of explorers. But for those who knew his story best, the greatest honor was this, that medicine had changed its tone. It had become more careful, more human, more observant. Doctors started listening a bit longer. Scientists looked a little harder before discarding what didn't seem important. There was a growing awareness that even the smallest things, dust on a slide, a forgotten dish, might hold something extraordinary. In an era of atomic bombs and global politics, Fleming reminded the world of something quieter but no less powerful, the ability of one man, through patience and purpose, to transform pain into healing. Chapter 10. Beyond the legend. Legends are often sculpted into grand shapes, oversized, untouchable. But Alexander Fleming's story resists that. His legacy isn't a tale of lightning bolts or heroic battles. Instead, it is quiet, deliberate, and rooted in patience. It unfolds not like a myth, but like a seed, growing, branching, and still alive today. Years after his death, students in white coats still sit hunched over microscopes, peering into glass slides, chasing answers. In every hospital where infection is controlled, in every clinic where antibiotics are administered with care, Fleming's presence endures, not as a ghost, but as a guide. The discovery of penicillin was not just about one life saved, it was about changing what was possible. It redefined modern medicine. Before penicillin, doctors were often helpless against infections. After penicillin, they had hope, tools, and time. But the miracle never belonged to Fleming alone. He always said that chance played a part, that others like Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, Norman Heatley turned penicillin from a petri dish into a global cure. Fleming credited the team, the process, the system. He believed in shared effort, and in doing so, he quietly redefined what it meant to be great. The truth is, if Fleming had wiped away that dish in 1928, no one would have blamed him. No one would have known. The mold would have gone down the drain, and history would have continued without its hero. But he didn't. He paused. He looked. He asked, why didn't the bacteria grow there? It was that question, small and unremarkable on the surface, that opened the door. That is perhaps the heart of his legacy, a deep respect for the overlooked. In a world hungry for speed, Fleming modeled patience. In an age of ego, he chose humility. In a field that often rewarded competition, he showed generosity. He answered letters from strangers. He kept teaching until his final months. He never claimed perfection. He remained, until the end, a man rooted in observation and wonder. Today, the challenges are different. Antibiotic resistance continues to rise. Superbugs have emerged, bacteria that no longer respond to drugs. Scientists are working urgently to develop new antibiotics and alternative treatments. The balance between medicine and nature grows more delicate every year. But the lesson remains the same. Science is not a race. It is a dialogue with the unknown. Fleming's story reminds us that the answers we seek often live in unexpected places, in forgotten corners of a lab, in errors that seem meaningless, in the courage to look twice, and perhaps most importantly, in the refusal to ignore what doesn't make sense. He reminds us that even in a world filled with noise, silence has power. And though the name Fleming now appears in textbooks, in history timelines, and even on lunar maps, the true depth of his influence is less visible, but far more profound. It is seen every time a child survives a fever, every time a wound heals without spreading, every time a doctor says, "Take this, you'll feel better soon." These moments, small and everyday, are where the legacy lives. They are the true afterlife of science, when ideas no longer belong to their discoverer, but become part of the human experience. In that way, Alexander Fleming never truly left. He remains wherever there is careful observation, wherever someone pauses before discarding a result, wherever curiosity meets courage. And in that simple, quiet spirit, he continues to change the world. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.